Welcome to another episode of Jay's Analysis. This time we will cover the rest of The Anglo-American Establishment by Dr. Carroll Quigley. I must say every time, once again, we are not covering this book because Quigley is a great thinker. We're not covering this book because this is a social justice warrior attack on the Anglo-American establishment. Quigley is an apologist for this establishment, and he's writing from the Council on Foreign Relations archives. And so the works of Quigley constitute an inside look and a propagandist look into the establishment of the West and really the origins of the New World Order in the last 100 years. Now, if you heard last time, I discussed the topic of the major players and their ideology. In the last sections of the book, Quigley is going to update us and give us the into the 30s and 40s what their machinations were. In this section, he calls it the Milner Group, and that is Lord Alfred Milner, and then all of the cognate institutions around them. And so it's going to be very important because we're going to get an insight into the actual global government, how it's operated, and how it still operates today, even though it has kind of shifted out of the English sphere and then it has moved into, obviously, the American sphere. So let's look at that right now. Now, a little bit of brief review before we get into the second half. We saw in the first half, and if you haven't heard the full lectures that I did last year on the totality of Tragedy and Hope, which is, again, his 1,300-page magnum opus that details the 20th century, again, from the Council on Foreign Relations archives, go and listen to those lectures. This is really an addendum to that. So what you have is this older idea of the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth, we're told at least, is supposed to be grounded in the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yes, the Masonic ideals. And I don't think that's accidental. I mean, this is really the origin of modern-day Freemasonry comes out of England. Now, I do view Masonry as a conspiratorial organization, and that's precisely because of the way that they themselves speak of the organization. We can also see that everywhere that Masonry goes, the promotion of liberty, equality, and fraternity and, quote, democracy end up being the modus operandi in the social, governmental, societal sphere, basically. What do you get? You get the beheading of the monarchs, you get Jacobins, you get all these different revolutionary, quote-unquote, forces that try to install the ideal republic, right? The republic that's supposed to be based on reason, but eventually this becomes democracies. This is where we are in the modern world. We're being told that, that older phase of Republican revolution needs to give way to democracy, right? So-called egalitarianism, equalitarianism. Now, all of these ideas, again, are really out of the philosophical schools of the Enlightenment and then the post-Enlightenment period, which are grounded in various ideas of a change in anthropology from the ancient and medieval world, many subjects that we've detailed countless times. But it's also important to understand that it's more of an oligarchy, and ironically, even Plato described the fact that democracy is an oligarchic institution, in that it's really big families and moneyed oligarchs that are always behind democracy, because democracy isn't really about the people. It's about the most manipulative, controlling the masses through base desire type philosophy imaginable. And that's really what we're looking at here. And so what we get with this group in the central area of the British Imperium is the attempt to manage all of their colonies at the turn of the century, the 1890s into 1900, through various models and plans. And what they found was that the best model would be this kind of so-called democratic model, right? We're going to use democracy in the various colonies and let the people think that they have democracy, quote unquote. Meanwhile, it's all going to be run by a shadow banking institution, and that shadow banking institution is housed in the city of London. It is the Lord Rothschild is one of the key founders of this organization, and it's called the Secret Society of the Elect. And this is what Cecil Rhodes, the great diamond magnate of South Africa, this was his idea, was working in tandem with Nathan Rothschild, was the idea of creating a liberal imperium, the idea of a commonwealth of nations based on the British Commonwealth idea for the whole world. And as a result, various areas of the globe, eventually they came to the conclusion, would have to be split up into zones, global zones. And this roughly corresponds over time to really continental unions or federations. And so this is the group that we're talking about here, this Society of the Elect, that is behind the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the U.S. version of that, Chatham House, which is one of their central ideological publication / propaganda outlets. It's the Royal Society, which goes back even further than the Royal Institute for International Affairs. It's the lodges of Masonry, which interestingly Quigley leaves out. That has no place in his treatment. I mean, as a historian, you're going to treat of the 20th century, and you're not going to talk about a movement that is in pretty much every country in the world. I mean, give me a break. And I mean, there are scholarly books on this very fact: Builders of Empire, Freemasonry and British Imperialism, 1717 to 1927. And it was an expensive book. I got this because it's a very important aspect that Quigley just leaves out. It plays no place in his supposed historical treatment. But remember, what did we see last time? Well, we saw that this group, again, that it's not solely royalty. The king is really kind of being told in many ways what to do by this inner group. So we're not really talking about the king and the queen or whoever. We're talking about an inner group of thinkers, what we might call the brains, and then the financiers. And this would be the big money families and industrialists. And then you have the revolving door phenomena, where these people are then put into the various government positions, and then they rotate out of that into the many private foundation, think tank, educational institutions, and so forth. They really play these key roles because they're situated at important nodes or places in society, right? So this is literally how Quigley describes it. Again, Quigley, mainline historian, not a conspiracy theorist. Quigley very much an apologist for this group, not an opponent, a sincere duped believer, an idiot, basically. And, you know, it's hard to tell exactly to what degree Quigley is just a retard or to what degree he is nefarious. I think it's a lot easier case to make that he just so blatantly contradicts himself so many times that I think he really believes this stuff, which just makes him all the more ridiculous. He's also a shitty writer. The writing is terrible. It's the most boring, technical, uninteresting writing that you could ever torture yourself with. So you ought to be thankful that I am here doing this for you. I mean, people, I don't understand these people that get so mad at me for making these videos and talking about this stuff, and all these hateful comments and just vile, disgusting comments that I get at times. And I mean, who else is doing this for you? Who else is doing this? I mean, there are a couple other sites that do this stuff. I'm not knocking them, but I'm saying nobody else is reading 1,300-page books and summarizing them for you, and then going and reading the extra 300-page addendum and summarizing it for you. So I'm doing a great service for you here. I'm helping you, and you know, it seems like the more popular that the site gets, the more attention and traction that the site gets and my work gets. You know, the more opposition. Obviously, I understand that that's natural. I'm not worried about that. I'm not scared. It's just ludicrous to me that, you know, that so many people are so petty. You know, I mean, all that's doing is hurting you. You're not hurting me. You're not stopping me and what I'm doing. In fact, I'm stepping up my game. I'm going to be knocking out more of these globalist books on a regular basis than I have been, precisely because the first season of the television show is finished. So I have a lot more time now to focus on this stuff, which I think is the real crucial stuff. I love Hollywood. I love decoding film. but it's not the most important thing out there, right? I mean, this kind of stuff is really understanding our world, and it's the stuff that matters. Now, there's all these people in these different alt media circles out there, and they're all into these movements, and they're all hyped up, and they're radicalized. And I'm not saying everybody's wrong in these various views, but I mean, have any of you read this stuff? Do you know this stuff? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you understand how the 20th century got here? Before you go off railing on all these things, and before you bitch about me and what I talk about, have you looked at these things? Have you? I have, and the world is more complex than we would like to make it. I mean, in certain ways, it's more simple, right? It's not that complex. We are dealing with oligarchs that are running things, and that's pretty simple. But at the same time, there's a lot of complexity in the onion rings and the deceptions and the layers and the ways that they control things. But what we're going to see, as we said before, is that this book is really another window into one angle of that pyramid, right? This is the real pyramid that controls and runs most of the world. The Atlantis power block of the U.S., the U.K., Israel. This is the Western power block, and they're characterized as Atlantis precisely because the Atlantic Ocean has nothing to do with Atlantis, and because it's the sea power. The sea power represents monetarism, trade, right? This is what the sea is about. The land power, Russia, right? Eurasia. This represents stability, stasis, right? As opposed to the flux of the waves of the ocean, of the maritime powers and their imperium. So you have two kind of rival worldviews inherently based just solely upon the geography. And this goes back to Mackinder, one of the Royal Society strategists. This goes back to many of the 20th century's geopolitical strategists, and it's the continuation of most geopolitical writers and thinkers today, right? Alexander Dugin speaks this way still. We saw Brzezinski speaking this way. Many writers still use these kinds of categories to describe the layout of the world. But as we said, the secret society of Rhodes is modeled on Jesuitism and Roman Catholicism. And Rhodes functions as a kind of pope, I guess, with Lord Rothschild in this situation. And I've noted here for you how this situation began. And it began with the who Quigley calls the junta of Stead, Brett, and Milner. And of course, Lord Rothschild is up there. He mentions that later. And then you have these other circle of initiates, Cardinal Manning, interestingly, Lord Balfour, right? So this is what we're looking at early on. This is like the 1890s period when this was getting started, when Rhodes had this initial idea. And then as we move into the 20th century, the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, this is when they had really established, especially after World War I, all of the organs and infiltrators into the various aspects of society in order to influence society in their direction. So they were behind the League of Nations. They were behind eventually the G8, the G20, the G30, these kinds of groupings. They were behind the operations of Oxford, All Souls, many seats at Cambridge. And what this did was this allowed them to control who would go into the positions of power and influence in society. They didn't care about controlling every single thing. Really, they only worried about the important roles or seats of power and influence and controlling them. Just certain ones, right? And then certain magazines, the Times, eventually different media organizations. Eventually, they would control the BBC, the Ministry of Information. This group would eventually rule from a shadow perspective behind this facade of all these government people. And that's the model of the world that we have today, is these shadow financiers, these shadow corporate entities that roll behind this facade of the so-called elected officials, and by winning people over to this ideology, which, interesting, it's very important. It's based on propaganda. When we think about something like Foreign Affairs magazine, or when we think about the Roundtable magazine, we might think, oh, these are great works that are going to really give us philosophical depth and insight into. No, they're actually, as Quigley says, the highest levels of propaganda. So, for example, the Rhodes Scholarships that were offered to recruit the best and the brightest into this conspiracy, they were offered on the basis of propagandizing people. So it had really nothing to do with solely controlling everybody's perception. They only wanted to control certain people's perceptions, and then that would filter down into the rest of society. That's not very democratic, is it? I thought that they're always talking in glowing terms of democracy. Well, that's not democratic, is it? That's because they're not Democrats. They don't really believe in democracy, despite their endless spew, this Niagara Falls of vomit of democracy, that they just infinite vomit of democracy, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, liberty, equality, fraternity, vomit. It's nonstop until the whole society just swims in it, and it's like, oh yeah, democracy. Well, yeah, we believe that. Meanwhile, this place is a monarchy, and it's ruled by the most oligarchic secret society that the world has ever seen up to this point. And they've convinced the masses that they have democracy. Now, how do they do that? Well, at this time, they were convincing people through baloney propaganda about the British Empire being the civilizing force in the world. And, we have to really worry about Asiatic despotism, right? Germany and its Nazis, Japan and its empire, China, its imperium, Russia and the Tsar. Bad guys, all the bad guys. The only good guys in the whole world are the Anglo-American pragmatics, and their alignment, I guess you could say, with the eventual banking empires of Europe. That's not just Rothschilds and Jewish banking. That's also Catholic banking, Protestant banking, and Jewish banking, as Quigley points out. All of them in the West become aligned eventually. Why? Because their God is Mammon. If you're a banker, what system do you want in place globally? You want free trade. You want no tariffs. You want the ability for the nations to accept your currency, right? You control that currency and its issuance. All of these things is exactly what they did. And this is why Spengler is right and perceptive to call the West in its modern phase Homo economic. It's economic man who worships economy. Everything is viewed in terms of economics. And no longer is it viewed in terms of worldview, philosophy, theology, meaning. It's economic units of production, energy, and movable commodities. The sea power. The relativistic, nihilistic, sodomite sea power. So the Atlanticist goals is what we're going to talk about as we get into the rest of this video. But I'm going to stop it here just because this is really the introduction, the overall talk for the rest of the book. If you want to hear more, you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. You can also get a copy of my book, signed, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, over 100 5-star reviews in 9 months, and now a TV show on Gaia. You can subscribe to the TV show. The first episode has now appeared. They will appear weekly every Monday. The first episode is the Matrix Trilogy, where we dive into some pretty heavy philosophy and analyze the film from a lot of different angles, Jay Widener and I. And you can subscribe at Gaia for that. But as I said, this talk will continue at my website for subscribers. Thanks for watching.